Chapter 35. A deep, resonant gong shattered the silence of the mansion, reverberating through the stone walls like a death knell. Tyler shot up in bed, his breath misting in the freezing air. His heart pounded in his chest, half expecting some Addams-esque horror to emerge from the shadows. The fire in the grand fireplace had died sometime during the night, leaving the room frigid. His breath curled into wisps as he exhaled, and he shivered, rubbing his arms. The chill seeped through the heavy blankets, wrapping around him like icy fingers. The Hyde stirred in his mind, groaning dramatically. All this money, and they can't even afford a radiator? When was this place last renovated, the 1800s? Tyler swung his legs over the side of the bed, wincing as his bare feet touched the freezing stone floor. "Shut up," he muttered. "I mean, sure, I love a good haunted mansion, but some central heating wouldn't kill them. Then again, maybe it would." The Hyde snickered. Ignoring him, Tyler threw on a sweater, laced up his boots, and shrugged on the heavy black coat he'd taken to wearing since moving in yesterday. He could already feel the chill clinging to his bones, but he had somewhere to be. "What exactly are we looking for?" the Hyde mused as Tyler made his way through the dark hallways. "The kitchen," Tyler muttered under his breath. "You're sneaking out to steal food? I knew I liked you." Tyler rolled his eyes. "Not for me. Grandmama likes to have her black coffee early in the morning." "You sneaky rascal," the Hyde said, amused. "Cozying up to the old lady, are we?" Tyler didn't answer. The mansion was a maze, and the dim lanterns lining the corridors did little to help. Shadows danced along the walls, some of them a little too lifelike for his liking. He could swear one of the paintings turned its head to follow him as he passed. Eventually, he found the kitchen, a vast, Gothic space that looked like it belonged in a medieval castle rather than a family home. Pots and pans hung from iron racks, and dried herbs dangled from the ceiling like something out of an old apothecary. Lurch was already there, looming in the dim candlelight. The massive butler turned his head toward Tyler with an acknowledging grunt. "Lurch, where are the coffee beans?" The towering manservant let out another low groan before reaching up to a high shelf, retrieving a jar of coffee beans, a grinder, and a coffee filter. He then plucked the heavy kettle from the hearth and placed it onto a serving cart. "Thanks, Lurch," Tyler said, rolling the cart out into the hallway. "Look at you, playing the perfect houseguest," the Hyde teased. "If only your dad could see you now, former fugitive turned barista for a family of lunatics." Tyler ignored him and kept walking. As he passed through the corridors, he spotted things scuttling toward the greenhouse. Curious, he followed. Inside, the air was humid despite the winter outside. The greenhouse was a jungle of poisonous plants, carnivorous vines, and exotic creatures. Snakes curled lazily around tree branches, eerie insects skittered across leaves, and at the far end, a large glass tank bubbled ominously. Morticia and Grandmama were already awake. Tyler rolled the cart beside the old matriarch and started grinding the coffee beans. The rich, earthy aroma filled the air, and Grandmama inhaled deeply, sighing in satisfaction. "Here you are, Grandmama," he said, handing her the cup. She accepted it with a pleased smile, sipping it delicately. "Perfect as always, my boy. It's good to have someone who actually knows how to make a proper cup of coffee in this house." Tyler smirked. "You're too kind." He glanced out the glass panels of the greenhouse. "Looks like it snowed overnight. But the plants seem to be doing fine." "Ah, yes," Morticia murmured, stroking the long, twisting vines of a massive carnivorous plant. "We finally installed a radiator. Cleopatra doesn't like the cold. What that stupid plant gets a radiator while we nearly froze last night." Hyde said to Tyler as he raised an eyebrow at the monstrous plant, watching as it snapped greedily at the raw meat she was feeding it. Morticia turned to him and handed him a plate. On it sat an enormous pork leg, raw and glistening. "Darling, would you mind feeding the fish?" she asked sweetly. "Just drop it into the tank." Tyler stared at the plate, then at the glass tank. Inside, shadows lurked beneath the water, barely visible, but he could make out the faint glint of sharp teeth. Are these piranhas? The Hyde finished gleefully. Later that morning, Tyler swung the axe again, the sharp blade biting into the thick stump with a satisfying crack. His breath puffed out visible clouds in the frigid air, and the repetitive motion of chopping firewood did little to silence the Hyde's constant stream of complaints. "You know we don't have to do all this," the Hyde grumbled from inside Tyler's mind, clearly irritated. "I mean, look at you, swinging an axe in the freezing cold for people who probably have enough money to heat an entire neighborhood, and they're making you chop wood." Tyler paused for a moment, wiping sweat from his brow, despite the cold. The firewood wasn't going to chop itself, and there was no way he was going to leave it all for someone else to handle. Not with how often things went awry in this place. "They're letting us stay here for free. We have to help out somehow," Tyler muttered under his breath as he lined up the next log. "Didn't you hear what Mr. Addams said last night?" The Hyde's voice was mocking, as if mimicking a rich aristocrat. "Our only job is to make Cockroach happy." Tyler gritted his teeth and tightened his grip on the axe. "Shut up." The Hyde seemed to take that as an invitation. There was a sudden jolt, and Tyler felt his body go stiff as the Hyde attempted to take over. He felt the pull of his alter ego's will, trying to divert him back inside the mansion where warmth and comfort awaited. "Just let me handle this," the Hyde hissed as Tyler's body involuntarily started to turn toward the door. "We could be in the warm mansion, enjoying all the luxuries, instead of this." Tyler grunted in frustration and focused, fighting for control. The axe blade shuddered as he slammed it down into the wood, and slowly, inch by inch, he fought back. The Hyde growled in his mind, but Tyler wasn't going to give in that easily. "No," Tyler bit out, resisting the Hyde's influence. "We can't just lounge around by Wednesday's side all day. Even she has her limits too, you know?" The Hyde snickered, clearly amused. "Ah, that's where you're wrong, mate. She loves the attention. Besides, you've already been doing plenty of things for her family. Look at you, chopping firewood like some kind of indentured servant." Tyler paused, taking a deep breath as he pushed the Hyde back into the recesses of his mind. "We can't be seen as freeloaders. I'm not going to wake up to another freezing room. There are a lot of rooms to heat up, and if I don't do this, then no one else will." The Hyde scoffed, the voice growing louder with frustration. "You're being ridiculous, you know that? Just ask for a radiator. How hard could it be? They've got one in the greenhouse for that carnivorous plant of theirs, but they can't get one in our room. What is this? A punishment?" Tyler shook his head, annoyed. "That's because they can't very well put a fire in a greenhouse," he snapped, chopping the next piece of wood with more force than necessary. "The plants need warmth. The Addams family runs things their own way. We're just guests." The Hyde let out a dramatic sigh. "Guests, huh? If you keep putting in all this effort, soon they'll have you polishing the silverware, too." Tyler gritted his teeth and swung the axe again, ignoring the Hyde's sarcastic comments. He was used to it by now. The cold wind whipped around him, but the work was familiar, comforting even in its own way. It was the kind of thing his father never expected him to do, and yet here he was, chopping firewood for the eccentric family that had opened their home to him. What he didn't know was that across the way, Wednesday had been watching him from one of the mansion's windows. She stood there, silent and still as ever, her sharp eyes observing Tyler's every move with an unreadable expression. Her gaze lingered on him, her mind racing, calculating. The sight of him, so lost in his inner struggle against the Hyde, so determined to help out, made her feel something strange. Something she didn't entirely understand. But as the winter wind held outside and Tyler continued his work, she remained impassive, her eyes never leaving him. Tyler exhaled, watching the last log split cleanly beneath the axe. His arms ached, his fingers were stiff from the cold, but finally, the firewood was chopped. He straightened up, rolling his shoulders as the Hyde continued grumbling in the back of his mind. "You know, I could have saved us so much time if you'd just let me take over," the Hyde muttered. "We'd have been inside, warm, hours ago." Tyler ignored him, stacking the last pieces onto the cart before hauling them toward the mansion. As soon as he stepped inside, warmth rushed to meet him, a stark contrast to the icy outdoors. His breath no longer hung in the air, and he sighed in relief. Things skittered into view, his fingers tapping rapidly against the wooden floor. The disembodied hand pointed toward the dumbwaiter, then gave an exaggerated thumbs up as if to say, "Finally, you're done." Tyler smirked. Yeah. I get it. Show me where this goes." Thing hopped onto the dumbwaiter, gesturing dramatically for Tyler to follow. He opened the small wooden compartment, indicating where the logs should be loaded. Tyler placed the first few bundles inside, watching as Thing carefully signed which rooms needed refueling. "Okay, got it," Tyler said, hauling the rest of the wood upstairs. He stacked the logs into a small wagon and began distributing them room by room. The old mansion creaked under his steps as he moved down the hallway, methodically placing each bundle beside the various fireplaces. When he passed by his own room, the Hyde piped up again. "Hey, idiot, might as well put 2 piles in here since you're already here," the Hyde scoffed. Tyler sighed but gave in, stacking 2 bundles near the hearth before moving on. Eventually, he was left with only 2 piles in the wagon. He frowned, trying to recall if he had missed a room. "Cockroach's room," the Hyde reminded him. "Right," Tyler muttered under his breath. He turned toward the last hallway, pushing the wagon until he reached Wednesday's door. For a moment, he hesitated. Out of everyone in the mansion, Wednesday was the least likely to need, or ask, for firewood. Yet, here he was. He knocked once. "Enter," came Wednesday's monotone reply. Tyler pushed the door open and immediately took in his surroundings. Wednesday's room was exactly as he imagined, dark, meticulous, and strangely elegant. The walls were a deep shade of black, lined with shelves filled with books, preserved specimens, and antique trinkets. Her massive 4-poster bed had an intricately carved headboard, the sheets a stark contrast of black silk. A raven perched on a nearby stand, watching him with beady eyes. The fireplace, currently dark, was the only real source of warmth in the otherwise cold and eerie space. She sat at her desk, fingers poised over her typewriter, dressed in her usual black ensemble. The sound of rapid, rhythmic keystrokes filled the air until they abruptly stopped. "Just put it next to the fireplace," she instructed, not bothering to look up. Tyler placed the firewood down carefully. "Would you mind lighting it?" she added, still focused on her work. Without a word, he crouched down and set the logs in place, striking a match and coaxing a small flame to life. The fire crackled to life, casting flickering shadows across the room. Then, the typewriter fell silent. Tyler felt a shift in the air, just before Wednesday moved. She walked toward him with quiet, deliberate steps, stopping just in front of where he crouched. Before he could stand, she grabbed his wrist, tugging him up and pulling him toward the antique sofa that faced the fireplace. Without hesitation, she pushed him down onto the seat. Tyler barely had time to process what was happening before Wednesday climbed onto his lap, settling herself with a level of confidence that left him speechless. She took his hand, turning it over in her own, inspecting his palm with a clinical gaze. Her fingers traced along his skin, her expression unreadable. His hands, despite his effort, were still relatively smooth. No calluses. No rough edges. Not yet. Tyler swallowed, his breath hitching slightly as he looked down at her. This was new. Wednesday, perched on his lap, her small frame pressing against him, was examining him like a particularly interesting specimen. Her fingers brushed over his knuckles, trailing along his wrist, before resting lightly on his palm. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Tyler, unable to stop himself, smirked slightly. His free arm curled around her waist, pulling her in just a little closer, making her more comfortable. Wednesday, unfazed, adjusted accordingly, resting her head lightly against his chest as she continued her silent inspection. Inside his mind, the Hyde was roaring in triumph. "Forget everything I said," the Hyde declared, his voice giddy. "Chop as much firewood as you want. in fact, chop extra. If this is how we end up at the end of the day, you can build an entire damn asterisk cabin. Tyler chuckled softly, low enough that only he could hear it. Maybe, just maybe, all that firewood had been worth it. As the fire crackled beside them, its warm glow casting flickering shadows across the dimly lit room, Wednesday finally lifted her gaze to meet Tyler's. Her dark eyes studied him, intense, calculating, yet unreadable. The way he held her, the way his fingers unconsciously tightened around her waist as if grounding himself in her presence, did not go unnoticed. She raised a hand, slowly, deliberately, her fingers brushing over his jawline. Tyler stilled at the touch, his breath caught somewhere in his throat as her cool fingertips ghosted over his skin, tracing the faint hint of stubble along his cheek. Her hand slid upward, cradling his face, and Tyler leaned into the touch before he could stop himself. She was small compared to him, but the weight of her presence was undeniable. She had always been the one in control, the one who dictated the terms of their strange, dark relationship. But this was different. Her thumb brushed over his lower lip, testing, contemplating. And then, as if she had reached a silent conclusion, she leaned in. Tyler barely had time to react before her lips met his. The kiss was slow at first, careful, deliberate, like the beginning of an experiment. But the moment Tyler responded, tilting his head and pulling her closer, the caution melted away. Wednesday pressed against him, her fingers tangling in his hair, tugging ever so slightly as she deepened the kiss. A quiet, pleased hum vibrated against his lips, and Tyler couldn't help the way his hands roamed, one pressing against the small of her back, the other gripping her thigh, holding her there, unwilling to let go. The Hyde, for once, was silent. Or maybe he wasn't silent at all. Maybe he was simply savoring this just as much as Tyler was, reveling in the feeling of Wednesday in his arms, the heat of her body against his, the way she kissed with the same level of certainty and intensity that she approached everything else in life. The kiss turned desperate, their breaths mingling in the firelight. Tyler felt himself slipping, into her, into this moment, into something that felt dangerously addictive. His hand slid up her back, fingers grazing over the lace trim of her dress, while hers tightened around his shoulders, pulling him impossibly closer. And then, something shifted. The Hyde stirred. A jolt ran through Tyler's body as his control wavered, just for a second, but it was enough. A low, pleased growl rumbled in his chest, and before Tyler could even process what was happening, his grip on Wednesday changed. Stronger. More possessive. She let out a soft sound of protest as he shifted beneath her, his arms tightening around her waist. Then, in one smooth, effortless motion, he stood, lifting her with ease. Wednesday's sharp eyes flickered with something unreadable, surprise? Curiosity, as her arms instinctively tightened around his shoulders. But she didn't resist. The Hyde smirked. Tyler, no, the Hyde, carried her toward the bed, the firelight casting long, dramatic shadows across the room as he moved. And just as he reached the edge of the bed, just as he prepared to lay her down, the fire crackled softly, casting flickering golden light across the dark walls. Tyler felt the warmth seep into his skin, but it was nothing compared to the quiet intensity of Wednesday's gaze. She lifted her head from his chest, her dark eyes studying him with an unreadable expression. Then, slowly, deliberately, she reached up and cupped his face in her small hands, her thumbs brushing against his cheekbones. The black silk sheets rustled beneath her, the dim firelight catching in her dark eyes as she looked up at him. The Hyde was exultant, reveling in the sensation, but even he handled her with a reverence neither of them fully understood. Outside, snow fell steadily from the gray sky, blanketing the Addams estate in a soft layer of white. The bare trees stood still against the winter wind, the mansion looming dark and gothic beneath the overcast heavens. The world outside was quiet. Almost peaceful. Inside, the fire in Wednesday's room flickered gently, the only sound in the vast, shadowed space. Tyler and Wednesday lay together beneath the thick, heavy blanket, her small form tucked effortlessly against his side. The room was warm, silent but for their steady breathing. Wednesday's head rested against his bare chest, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing patterns along his arm. Tyler, still half lost in the hazy warmth of the moment, let his eyes drift to the ceiling. The Hyde was unusually quiet. Satisfied. And for once, Tyler didn't argue with him. This was enough. Like, comment and subscribe to be notified for updates in the series.